All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm going to welcome everyone on behalf of Rabbi Marsha and the Jewish Collaborative. She'll hopefully come in a little bit, but she was a little bit busy as of this morning. But it is an honor to be welcomed back by Rabbi Marsha and the community at the Jewish Collaborative. A little bit of an introduction of what we are going to do. This is a 5-week series, but unlike other series that I've done, this one, every class could be its own standalone. So we're going to tackle 5 thinkers that I've called overlooked thinkers. Not that these are, not household names. I'm sure people have heard of at least some of the thinkers on our list, but I just wanted to run through thinkers that typically wouldn't make it to sort of the first level classes in Jewish history or Jewish studies. But I think each of these thinkers tackle big picture questions in the Jewish community very differently. And through the 5 thinkers that we're going to look at over the next 5 weeks, we'll be able to touch on a lot of big picture questions within Jewish history. So I'm very excited to get into this. And I think the best way is just to jump right in. So most of you have been in previous classes, so I enjoy the conversation style. So I'll kind of present some ideas. I'll give one more sort of introductory premise, which is every one of the thinkers we're going to see over the next 5 weeks have very strong opinions and say things that almost certainly will be either very agreeable or very disagreeable at times, which I think is part of the fun. And I think as we tackle these larger conversations, we can hopefully approach it with the nuance that I think all of these questions demand and deserve. So let's hop right into it. And today our first class is going to be on Gershom Scholem. And I'll give a little bit of an introduction, but I wanted to start off with Scholem's most provocative idea just to sort of whet people's appetite. And Gershom Scholem, as we'll soon see, was one of the luminary towering figures of Jewish studies all throughout the 20th century. He lived a very long time. I think he passed away in the 1980s or 1990s. He was born in 1897 in Berlin, and so he lived throughout both world wars, the founding of the State of Israel, the Six-Day War, right? Like, think every big picture event in the 20th century Jewish community, Gershom Scholem lived through and was a leading Jewish intellectual and academic through that time. And Gershom Scholem, and we'll see more of a biographical sense of him on the next slide, in his most provocative work, he writes a book called Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera, which for those who know Hebrew, know to mean a mitzvah, right? So something that is, it's sometimes translated into good deed. We all know mitzvah literally means a commandment, but, a positive Jewish action, haba ba'avera, right, that comes by way of a avera, right, a sin, a negative action, or anything there. And Gershom Scholem is quoting a Jewish tradition that has tried to be forgotten in the rest of the Jewish community. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on this one point that I'm going to make. I just want to present it here to sort of whet people's appetite. But there was a Jewish thinker, false messiah, Jewish leader named Shabtai Tzvi that we're going to spend a lot of time on today. And Shabtai Tzvi founded really one can call it a Jewish philosophy, you can call it a Jewish denomination, you can call it a hiccup in Jewish history. But Shabtai Tzvi proclaimed this radical idea that you can actually commit transgressions or sins, and that can have a higher value than a mitzvah, right? Which is, again, completely antithetical to the rest of the Jewish tradition. And this is going to be an idea that Gershom Scholem in some way is going to run with as part of his Jewish philosophy, but we'll have to see a little bit how he ends up getting there. I just wanted to paint your appetite, lest you were thinking of leaving early. So who is Gershom Scholem? Why is he interesting? Why is he important? A couple of general biographical pieces of data. I mentioned before his lifespan from 1897 to 1982. Again, you can think of all the fascinating Jewish historic events that took place in this time. And Gershom Scholem, again, was born in Berlin. He, for fear of rising anti-Semitism, he moved to Palestine in 1923, shortly after World War I. He was an early Zionist, although he was more associated with the cultural Zionism of Achad Ha'am. So a little bit on that debate. I'll try not to get too caught up in this debate, but I think one of the interesting things about Gershom Scholem, and one of the reasons why I picked him as my first thinker, is you can see almost every debate the Jewish world has had in the last 100 years really through the biography of Gershom Scholem in some way. So he's both a pivotal thinker as an individual, but he's also just a great sort of a springboard for further conversations about tensions in the Jewish world. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as the Zionist movement was starting in Western Europe, I always say the Zionist movement was a very fringe movement until after World War I. In other words, if one took a time machine to anywhere that Jews were living in mass in the year 1900, right, say you drop into New York, or you drop into France, or you drop into Eastern Europe, right, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, or you go to Iran or Iraq, and you were to talk about Zionism in the year 1900, very few people would be on board, right? Most would probably have some idea of what you were talking about, but it would be very rare to find a lot of people becoming Zionists before World War I. And inside the Zionist camp, there was a big debate about what the need for Zionism was. We're probably all familiar with Theodor Herzl, who was seen as one of the fathers of political Zionism. We can, endlessly debate if that's right or wrong. There were earlier thinkers in Europe before Herzl, such as Leon Pinsker and Moshe Hess, who sort of had the idea that Herzl ran with a couple decades earlier, but the political Zionists viewed a state of Israel as important because Jews need safety, right? Jews as in the Jewish people. Echad Ha'am, or Asher Ginsburg, who was the rival Zionist camp, argued that it's not Jews who need Israel, it's Judaism, right? It's the religious traditions that are at risk of becoming overly stale in the diaspora, and that Zionism, or the state of Israel, or a collection of Jews in the historic Jewish homeland, as Echad Ha'am would prefer to say, was important to revitalize Judaism, right? There's something about the creative power of Judaism that's lacking in the diaspora. One example that I always give, which I think is a very sort of obvious example, is if in America today in 2026, this is not a political statement, this is a sociologic statement, but we are in a country that is culturally Christian. In other words, what that means is the public sphere and the calendar and many of the ways in which we talk about things are controlled by Christian history and Christian culture, right? The example I always give when I teach this to my UCI students is I know that I'm going to have off for the next 10 years on December 25th, right? I don't even need to check the calendar next year. I know that if I am teaching for a public school system, right, UC Irvine, I don't have to see, will I be off Christmas in 2 years? I know I will be off Christmas in 2 years, right? Because we're in a culturally Christian country. So what Echad Ha'am was saying is when Judaism is not the dominant cultural force, Judaism loses something. And in order for Judaism to be at its maximal creative capacity, Judaism needs to be in control of the public sphere. So that means the calendar, that means what decorations are lined on the streets, what do public cemeteries look like in terms of what religious symbolism they're going to use, all of that. So Gershom Scholem, and we'll see why in a minute, was much more aligned with that view of Zionism, right? That Zionism is important for cultural reasons, and we'll sort of see how this connects to his larger view of Judaism in a minute, but just to run through his biography, he moves to British Mandate Palestine in the interwar period, and he becomes the head librarian for the it wasn't called the Israel National Library then, but the precursor to the Israel National Library, where he became a librarian of ancient Jewish texts. And so he did lots of work on medieval mystical texts from the Cairo Geniza. He then eventually, throughout the 1940s, did a lot of work on the newly found Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947. And so he spent most of his career as sort of a very academic literary scholar, doing the painstaking work of comparing different manuscripts and everything there. He eventually becomes a lecturer and then a full professor at Hebrew University, and he begins teaching about a set of esoteric ideas that we now call Kabbalah, or was then called Kabbalah, and he founded the modern study of Jewish mysticism. And so many scholars actually credit Scholem with creating the phrase Jewish mysticism, right? Today, if I say Jewish mysticism, you probably all have at least some idea of what I'm talking about. If not, we'll talk about some of the ideas in a few minutes. But it was really Gershom Scholem that founded this field of study. And this was not without controversy. The last thing I'll say about Scholem before moving on is that everything he did and said was very much controversial, both in terms of his understanding of Jewish history, his interpretation, and also his normative views about Judaism, what Judaism should be. So people disagreed with both what he thought Judaism was and what he thinks Judaism should be, which is, again, part of the fun of Gershom Scholem. Just a couple more biographic details. both within Judaism and without, Scholem is now widely respected to be a religious theorist. And so what that means is he's not just somebody who studied religion as a historian or as a sociologist, but he actually theorized as to what makes religions tick, which is going to be interesting when we compare that to Judaism. And he was also a theorist of Zionism, right? He was both a Zionist, but he also tried to contextualize Zionism within Jewish history, which again was quite rare because the dominant Zionistic viewpoint, at least pre-World War I, was that Zionists viewed what they were doing as a conscious break from Jewish history, right? If one were to ask Theodor Herzl or one were to ask many of the early political Zionists, do you view your project as a project that is in continuity with some Jewish tradition or Judaism? Most of them would say, no, of course not, right? Part of our Zionism is actually a conscious break from Jewish tradition, right? We don't like the fact that Jews have been these overly scholarly, legalistic people in the diaspora for thousands of years. We need to throw that off. We need to forget about the Talmud. We need to go back to our roots, right, as an ancient people in a historic land. So they weren't denying that Jews have roots in Israel, but they were saying that Judaism itself is actually in some way leading to the diasporic mindset that Zionism is trying to fix, right? The most obvious example of this is in Bialik's poem in 1903, where he talks about the Kishinev pogroms. And he paints this, sort of parallel where he talks about the Zionists, who are these, large, very strong, tanned men who are, and also women who are in the homeland, tilling the land. And meanwhile, you have the Kishinev pogroms in Eastern Europe, right? Perhaps the most brutal pogrom in Eastern European history, right? There are a couple of different pogroms that can vie for the leader there. And he writes that the diasporic Jews were going like sheep to the slaughter. This is where this term originates. And he said that they gathered, and instead of fighting back, they were praying to God, right? And so that's how the political Zionists saw the diaspora, as a bunch of people who were just so obsessed with religion that they were unable to see the bigger picture. And what Scholem does, and we'll see this on a later slide, is he wants to argue back against the political Zionists and say, no, Zionism is actually in continuity with Jewish tradition. And this gets to the last point, just in terms of a broad overview, whereas Scholem's personal views are somewhat of a modern enigma. In other words, you ask 2 or 3 scholars, and one of the fun things is that, there are plenty of speeches and lectures that are recorded from Scholem. Again, he died only 30 or 40 years ago. And scholars today still debate exactly what Scholem believed about things like Judaism and God and Zionism, which again, I think, makes it all part of the fun. So this is a broad overview. And now let's dip into some of the ideas. Again, if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll sort of pause at natural times, but feel free to cut me off. Okay. So Scholem starts off as really a Jewish historian. And one of the things that many Jewish historians, especially in the early 20th century, were trying to do is talk about what we would call today to be grand narratives of Jewish history. In other words, most people here are probably familiar with the general contours of Jewish history: the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, medieval, right? At some point, Jewish modernity, right? I'm not going to assume that people have a lot of knowledge on that, but I'm going to guess, looking through everyone here, who I think I know, almost everyone here, right? We have some good collective knowledge of the general contours of Jewish history. But Scholem wanted to press one level further and ask, how do we understand the unfolding of Jewish history? In other words, how does history actually evolve? And what Scholem is going to suggest is that Jewish history is not going to be this neat linear line, but Jewish tradition unfolds through what he called a persistent duality, right? Duality meaning, 2. And so for Scholem, there was 2 opposing forces within Jewish history, that in every generation there was tension between these 2 forces. For those that are, students or, that understand German philosophy in the 1800s, right? This has some whims of, people like Hegel, who understood all of history to unfold through opposing forces, right? You have force A, you have counter force A, and these eventually breed some synthesis for the next generation. And so Scholem very much understood Jewish history between this dialectic, right? So 2 opposite things that are constantly battling each other within the Jewish community. What are those two things? So the first thing is going to be what most of us would consider to be classical Judaism, right? You have the tradition, right? Tradition meaning the Torah and the Talmud and the Jewish legal codes, right? Such as Maimonides and Joseph Cairo's Shulchan Aruch. And that represents, right, halacha, right? Halacha as a shorthand for both Jewish law, but also halacha in its broader sense, right, comes from the word, holech, lalechet, right? The general goings of Jewish tradition. And this represents both law and stability and continuity, right? One of the great things about the halachic tradition is there's constant continuity, right? It's not to say that halacha is stagnant, right? Jewish law obviously changes, right? We are, the obvious example, we're no longer sacrificing lambs during Passover. We're having a Seder at home. But generally, the halachic tradition attempts to create continuity. So just, the Passover example, even though it obviously ended a couple of days ago, is that even the rabbis in their discussion of Passover and changing Passover from, again, a Paschal lamb in a temple to a Seder at home, the rabbis explicitly make the connection, right? So if we go through different things we do at the Seder, we are constantly saying we are doing this because in the temple they used to do that, right? So for Scholem, the traditional or halachic aspect of Judaism represented stability and continuity. The opposing force to that is what he considered to be the mystical or messianic force that is the sort of undercurrent in Judaism, right? I put here one of the most famous, scholars of Gershom Scholem, David Bialy, who wrote a book called Kabbalah and Counterhistory. And so one could call this a dialectic, but you can also consider Scholem suggesting or positing that within Jewish history, there's also a counter-history to the tradition and halacha, which is the Jewish mystical and messianic tradition. And if Jewish law represents continuity, messianism or mysticism represents what he called rupture or transformation, right? The Messiah, right, or messianism, does not care if things are the same this week as they were last week, right? In some sense, the whole point of messianism is that things are going to be different, right? You could also think of this as the difference between, slow evolution versus revolution, right? If you are trying to slowly evolve something, you want that thing to generally seem the same day after day, even though it's slightly changing, right? Think politics, right? If you want evolutionary politics, you don't want things to change too quickly because that could make things unstable. If you're calling for revolution, on the other hand, right, the whole point is to radically change everything. So you don't care how many things you break along the way. You don't care what rules or norms you're breaking. You are hoping to radically transform things. And for Scholem, Judaism has always had this undercurrent flowing within it. Now, this, understandably, was seen as dangerous by Jewish leaders. And so what Scholem suggested is throughout all of Jewish history, there was this tense equilibrium that was happening between these forces. And I'll give some concrete examples in a second from Jewish history for those that prefer concrete examples versus theory. Jewish history is a tense equilibrium between these forces, but generally in normal times, or I'm going to, to the extent that there is such a thing as a, normal century in Jewish history, the mystical forces are able to be held at bay by the tradition or the halacha. And so just a couple of examples before I go to the counter example. And this is something I teach. I'm right now teaching at UCI a class on Jewish law. So we're talking about some similar ideas here. Law, right, whether we think of it as Jewish law or even American law, is a great counter-revolutionary force. In other words, if people are paying attention to law, right, you can think of it as the law of a state or the law of a religious tradition, Jewish law, they're probably not going to revolt, right? The act of revolution, in other words, is an act of saying these laws no longer apply. Now, sometimes revolutions are good, sometimes they're bad, but revolution is the opposite of law and stability. And so for Scholem, for most of Jewish history, the law, right, Jewish law, halacha, does its work, right? It's able to quell these forces of myth and rupture and messianism at bay, but every once in a while, and for Scholem, this is when political or social crisis happens, mystical forces in Judaism can swell up and overcome tradition. And it just so happens, again, as a scholar of Jewish history, Scholem knew this, and we all know this here, Jews have had many crises throughout history, right? Many times in which there have been, horrible events of, magnificent proportion happening to the Jewish tradition. And it's at these moments, Scholem teaches, that the mystical forces are able to overcome the tradition and halacha and create something completely new, right? We'll get into this in a few minutes. One example, right, is the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? This is a very early example. This is a relatively non-controversial example. So I'll go non-controversial because at the end we're going to go full controversial in about 30 minutes. So I'll prepare everyone. The Bar Kokhba revolt was led by a Jewish general who was subsequently proclaimed Messiah in the year 132 CE. So for those who are Jewish historically minded, the Romans destroy the Second Temple in 70 CE. And with that, Jerusalem is burned down, the temple is destroyed, and some set of the Jewish community is already trying to rebuild in a place called Yavne, right, where they are working on the sort of Jewish intellectual or legal tradition, right? The Mishnah would eventually be a product of Yavne. On the other hand, there were still people living in Judea, right, the region around Jerusalem, who said, well, we need to figure out a way to force the Romans out of Israel. That was led, right, that came to a culmination 60 years after the destruction of the temple, led by a man named Bar Kokhba, who was proclaimed the Messiah by many Jewish leaders, right? Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah is probably the most famous example. And it's not a mistake that Rabbi Akiva is also one of the rabbis in the Talmud most associated with mysticism, right? These ideas sort of, remain consistent. And the Bar Kokhba revolt was this massive revolt against the Roman Empire that utterly failed, right? It's one of the darkest chapters, right, in early Jewish history. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, and the Romans barred Jews from living in the region of Judea. Most Jews at that point moved to Babylonia, which is where they produced the Talmud. Some smaller percentage of Jews moved up north to the Galilee. But the Bar Kokhba revolt utterly failed. But for Scholem, again, the Bar Kokhba revolt and the messianism of the Bar Kokhba revolt comes out of the destruction of the temple and the social catastrophes there, which is why you have this culmination of messianism that exists in the first place, right? Another example we can give, and we can spend, a little bit less time on each one of these, Lurianic Kabbalah, right? The Arizal, and we'll spend a whole slide on this, so I don't want to go too far here, really begins after the expulsion from Spain and Spanish Inquisition, right? So this is just another proof point, right? Sabbateanism, we'll spend also some time on this later, right? Shabtai Tzvi, who was a false messiah in the 17th century, right, spreads throughout the Jewish world after the Chmelnytsky massacres, right? A set of just horrific pogroms that happen in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so for Gershom Scholem, crises happen throughout Jewish history. And when crises happen, this neat equilibrium of Jewish history breaks, and the mystical forces are actually able to overcome tradition, and this actually changes Judaism. And so let's talk a little bit more about history, and then we'll get into some concrete events, and maybe I'll take some time for questions before we get into some of our case studies here. So Scholem divides Jewish history into three different periods. And this is going to be sort of interesting to think about sort of an overall view of Jewish history here. For Scholem, the biblical period represent in some way immediacy with the divine. And so, right, this was a period of prophecy, right? Humans had direct encounter with the divine. And for Scholem, both what he calls myth, right, the mystical tradition, and revelation, right, the legal tradition, are both alive and integrated. And for Scholem, at the late biblical period, you have a very interesting dialectic that takes place within the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. And anybody who's ever read the later books in Tanakh immediately knows, realizes this is true, where you have this attempt of monotheism to overcome mythology, right? What does that mean, right? To say this in layman's terms, the main point of the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh is Jewish leaders saying, stop worshiping idols, and Jewish people continuing to worship idols. And this seems all very strange from our modern perspective. I've never, right, there's a lot of things that we probably all are very interested in doing, but worshiping idols is probably not very high up on that list, right? I've never had a deep urge to worship idols, right? That is probably not, right, a big threat to the Jewish community of us all becoming idol worshipers. But for Scholem, right, this sort of misses the point. For Scholem, the pagan idolatrous tradition of Baal and Asherah and all these idols that the Tanakh continuously warns against represents mythology. And the Jewish leaders in the Tanakh represent the halacha, or the pure tradition of monotheism that's attempting to overcome that. And for Scholem, the fact that monotheism doesn't win, again, it doesn't mean that monotheism is bad or we want paganism, right? Scholem's often misunderstood as being in favor of the things that he describes. So I want to be careful not to do that. But for Scholem, monotheism itself, or pure monotheism, is not the only component of Judaism. And here's where he gets a little bit controversial. For Scholem, the mythology, and by that he would even include, say, a little bit of paganism, is in some way just as much of a part of early Judaism as monotheism. These two things are existing in dialectic with each other. For most of Jewish tradition, again, the monotheism is able to hold the mythological forces at bay, but every once in a while that fails, right? And you can clearly see that throughout Tanakh as well. His second period is going to be what he calls the containment period. And this is the rabbinic period. And this is when, again, Jewish law was at its highest point. So one just obvious example from Jewish history, I mentioned the Bar Kokhba revolt before. 60 years after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, decides that he has to formally write down the Mishnah and codify it and send it around to the Jewish communities. And again, for Scholem, the reason why there was such a expedient need to formalize a set of Jewish law and send it around to Jewish communities is because law is able to suppress, right, political revolutions or messianism, right? If the Jewish community is more invested in internal legal disputes, they're going to be less interested in political revolutionary messianic movements, right? The same logic applies backwards, by the way, to why the political Zionists were against Jewish tradition in Europe, right? The political Zionist view was, if you're too obsessed with Jewish tradition and Jewish law, you're not going to pay attention to wider political issues, right? So for Scholem, the Mishnah, or rabbinic literature, does exactly what it was supposed to do and quell the sort of Jewish mythology there, right? So law as a restraint to messianism. And then I promise in a second we're going to go outside of theory and talk about Scholem's some of his ideas, but I think this is a very important conceptual background to his overall ideas. The third chapter of Jewish history is what he calls the eruption. And that is the triumph, one might say, of mysticism or messianism over the containment of Jewish tradition. And for him, this all starts in the medieval Jewish tradition, where Jewish rationalism reaches a point that is so rationalistic and philosophic that it triggers the opposite reaction. And so one example of this is a figure like Moses Maimonides, Moses Maimonides was a 12th century Sephardic Jewish thinker who had a purely rationalistic view of God, right? Maimonides said you can never describe God, you can't attribute adjectives to God, right? Much of the mythological stories in the Torah, right, are clearly just metaphor, right? That was Maimonides. And so for Scholem, this represents the zinth, right, the height of the Jewish legal or containment tradition. And this then reached a backlash, which started producing all sorts of Jewish mysticism, right? You have the Zohar in Spain, and then later, after a couple hundred years, the mystical tradition culminates in Sabbateanism, or Shabtai Tzvi. We'll get to that in a second. And Scholem has a quote here, then this has been one of the more controversial quotes in Scholem's views of Judaism. And he says, as Jewish historians, we have clearly advanced beyond the vantage point of our predecessors, having learned to insist, and rightly so, that Jewish history is a process that can only be understood when viewed from within. But in spite of all this, our progress in applying this truth to concrete historic traditions, as opposed to general historiosophical theories, has been slow. In other words, what Scholem is suggesting is that whoever wins out of this dialectic between the legal and the mystical, this is not preordained. In other words, Jewish history and Jewish philosophy is a product of the Jewish community, not a product of top-down forces. And so, again, there's sort of endless debate, and one can still, if you do a quick Google search, you'll see two very different impulses among people who study Scholem. Does he believe in God? What did he think of, all of these big questions? And it's sort of unclear, because it's clear that Scholem thought that Jewish ideas and philosophy and history unfolded because of this dialectic within the Jewish people, not as something superimposed from without. Another way to say this is there's no predestined or preordained ideas that Judaism must produce. That if Judaism in 300 years from now looks wildly different than it does now, that is just in some way as authentically Jewish as if Judaism looks like something completely different, because for him, this dialectic was constant, and whatever this dialectic spits out, you can't predict it ahead of time. And so for Scholem, one can pretend like there's such thing as Jewish orthodoxy, right? I'm not talking about the Orthodox movement, but Jewish dogmas. But in reality, this is just a figment of imagination or an illusion to suggest that there are Jewish orthodoxies in general. Okay, I'll pause for a second before we get into a little bit more of Scholem's biography. I see there's one question from Mark. What insight does halacha provide Messianic Zionists regarding land property rights in the modern West Bank? So it's a good question, and Scholem actually commented later on in his life about what he considered to be a danger on the Israeli right. And so he actually first writes an essay in 1929, so this was fairly early on. In the 1920s, you had two rival political Zionist movements. I don't want to go too far afield here, but I'll attempt to paint a little picture. You had the classical political Zionists, right? The labor Zionists. They were, think David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, right? These were political Zionists, right? They viewed Jews as needing a state, but they were both socialist-oriented and also generally peace-oriented in their outlook towards both the Arabs and also the British government, right? They wanted to work with the British, and they didn't want to be overly antagonistic towards any of the various groups. On the other side, you had another Zionistic tradition known as revisionist Zionists that was founded by a man named Zev Jabotinsky. This group includes people like, say, Menachem Begin was a part of the revisionist Zionists that were a lot more aggressive and hostile towards the British government and wanted to go on the offense against the Arabs as opposed to just the defense. And Scholem was very critical of the latter group for reasons that I think will become clear throughout. So great question. Any other questions before we move on?
I have one quick question,
Yeah, go for it.
Professor Levine. So Scholem seems to frame this whole duality between the legalism and the mysticism, and that sort of changes throughout the history, like the biblical period, the rabbinic era. So my question is, if that framing stays consistent, right? But those forces appear differently throughout time. What are is that still in place today? And if so, what are those forces today?
Yeah, 100%. I love that question, and I think we're going to sort of naturally get to that in a little bit, because this is sort of one of his most controversial claims that answers your question. So love the question, and I think in 15 minutes it'll sort of naturally be answered. If not, then ask me again. But yeah, great question. So let's talk a little bit about, the history of what was happening in the Jewish community in the early years of Scholem's life and his sort of rise to scholarship. Because now we talked about some ideas. Now let's go a little bit back to, biography of Scholem and what was happening. So in 19th century Western Europe, so think 1850s in, Prussia, right? Modern day Germany, right? Even before Scholem was alive, you had the rise of a movement called the Wissenschaft des Judentums, right? It's German for the scientific study of Judaism. And this was a Jewish project, right? It was both political and religious and academic that attempted to fit Judaism into the construct of modern Western nation states. And I think most people here were in my modern Jewish thought class. I'm not going to assume everyone was, but we spent basically 10 weeks talking about this exact question here. So I won't spend too much time here. But generally speaking, there was a movement. Whoops, I don't know what I just did. Generally speaking, there was a large movement. Can everyone see this again? Perfect. There was a large movement to do a couple of things to Judaism. To one, say that Judaism was every bit as rationalistic as rationalistic Protestantism, right? So think people like Immanuel Kant, who were both, rationalist philosophers. They were also Protestant Germans. And there was this idea in German society, right, also existed in France, it also existed in England, where Judaism was some archaic, barbaric tradition, and Christianity represents the sort of new rationalist, pure faith. And so many Jewish scholars in the 1800s tried to combat this by essentially saying they're wrong. Judaism is every bit as rationalistic as Christianity. And also Judaism is a religion that can nicely fit into German society. So Jews are not a people, Jews are not a race, Jews are not any of these things. But, Judaism and Protestantism are very similar, aside from a couple of minor details that we shouldn't focus on. And this was, in general, the project of the Wissenschaft school. And the problem for these for this philosophy was that they looked to Eastern Europe. And at this time, there were many more Jews in Eastern Europe. And the Jews in Eastern Europe did not go through the same Enlightenment and period of political emancipation that Jews in Western Europe were going through. There was about 2-ish to 3, depending on, who you trust, Jews that were trapped in this large area called the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, which was a area that Jews had to live in throughout the 1800s in Eastern Europe. And the vast majority of Eastern European Jews were much more religious, right? This is where the Hasidic movement began. So your average Eastern European Jew in the year 1840 was not thinking about politics and, rationality and Immanuel Kant, right? They were much more religious. They were much more rural. They had simple faith. And so Western European Jews looked down upon Eastern European Jews, right? There were all sorts of slurs, right? Western European Jews wrote that Eastern European Jews were irrational and they didn't want to modernize and they were uneducated and unenlightened. And that they also represented, right, the epitome of sort of Jewish weirdness, right? There's a fascinating article that writes that Western European Jews projected the same anti-Semitism that they were receiving from non-Jews, they projected onto the Jews of Eastern Europe. In other words, the deflection, right? One can imagine this conversation. Jews in Western Europe would hear some critique of Judaism, right? Some, what we would consider today to be anti-Semitic, although this is pre-racial, right? Let's say 1820, right? They would have some criticism, right? Judaism is too legalistic, or Judaism is too mythological, or Judaism, whatever the idea is, right? And they would say, well, not us, right? You're talking about those Jews, right? The traditional Jews that are in, modern day Ukraine, right? But us, right? The Jews in France and Germany, we are very rational and we are practicing this sort of pure monotheistic faith, just the same as Protestants. This came to the point where there was even a slur called Ostjuden, right? Literally meaning Eastern Jews, which became a slur, right? It's sort of a bad word that Jews in the West used to talk about Jews in the East. And so Gershom Scholem steps into this milieu, right? He's obviously a product of Western Europe, right? He's in Berlin, but he decides that he, for the first time really in Jewish history, is going to take the mystical tradition that's considered to, as Eastern Jews, that he wants to take this seriously. And he starts off by looking for any scholar, right, or rabbi in Western Europe, right, Jewish academics that's taking the mystical tradition seriously. Because again, the Wissenschaft school, and this sort of, hopefully goes without saying, part of their project was to pretend that the Jewish mystical tradition did not exist. In other words, their view of Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism and Messianism is to say, yeah, that existed, but we don't really talk about that, or that was, some medieval institution that nobody believes in anymore, or yeah, a couple Jews view, mysticism as part of Jewish tradition, but really we know Judaism's all about, rationality. And Gershom Scholem is going to spend much of his career trying to reverse that idea. He was so successful, by the way, that today in every major Jewish studies department across the world, from America to Europe to Israel, right? Kabbalah is taken seriously as a part of academic study of Judaism. And also, any serious scholar of Judaism understands that Kabbalah has been just as much a part of Judaism as the Talmud or any other form. But before Scholem existed, right, none of this applied. And there's actually a funny anecdote that I came across a couple days ago where Scholem travels, right, once he's back living in Palestine, he travels back to Europe in the 1920s to meet with a professor of Jewish studies in Europe who was considered the most knowledgeable professor on medieval Kabbalah. And he goes into this professor's house and he notices, all these incredible Kabbalistic books. And he gets excited because he says, finally, I'm going to have some mentor to help me in this study of Kabbalah. And so he says, how wonderful it is, Herr Professor, that you have read and learned all this. To which the elderly gentleman replied, what? I also have to read all this nonsense? In other words, the back and forth is he realizes this professor in his collection of medieval Kabbalistic manuscripts didn't actually read any of it, right? He was almost collecting it as sort of, collector's items. But Scholem came to the realization that there hadn't actually been anyone in Jewish history that has ever actually looked into the Kabbalistic material and took it seriously. And he writes a little bit later on, right, a letter to his good friend Walter Benjamin, who sadly, Walter Benjamin ended up committing suicide because he was, to avoid being captured by the Nazis, right? It's sort of a sad part of the biography of Gershom Scholem because they were good friends. But he writes a letter to Walter Benjamin in the early years of his life, and he says as follows. He says, the canon of sacred Jewish writings from the diaspora and the Middle Ages, in other words, the Kabbalistic material, had fallen into such a state of disrepair and oblivion, fragmented and effaced from persecutions from without, as well as contortions, conversions, and schisms from within Judaism, that many of the finest writings from the major currents of Jewish mysticism can only be found in long block quotations in anti-Semitic texts, where some nincompoop who had quoted and translated the most wonderful and most profound things had assembled them in order to decry them as blasphemies. In other words, what Scholem is saying is the record of Jewish mysticism has been so maligned, right, both from within Judaism and without, right? There's been this sanitizing effort that in order for him to find quotes for one of his major books, right? One of his most famous books is Major Currents of Jewish Mysticism, that he had to, right, the only place he can find these quotes in the original were actually quoted in texts that were explicitly trying to malign the Jewish community, right? So anti-Semitic texts of groups talking about, a secret cabal of Jews trying to control the world, right? Then they quoted some Kabbalistic idea. But his point is that these ideas were taken so not seriously that there was no way for him to actually find this as well. So yes, there was just a question. Was there no religious tradition that took Kabbalah as holy text? Yes, there was, but none that engaged it as a serious academic study. And so you had, a couple quotes here and there, but there was nothing that, at least for a scholar, what his point is that the originals didn't exist in most of these capacities. So you have a text like, Sefer HaBahir, which was an early Kabbalistic work where we still don't really know the full version, and you try to read different translations today, and it just wasn't preserved in anywhere the same quality as the sort of more legalistic text. Okay, so let's talk about his sort of big idea now that we sort of have all the backgrounds. So I'm going to fly through this slide because this is a little bit of the Jewish historic background, and the next slide is where we're going to spend a little bit more time. But in 1492, as I said before, the Jewish community in Spain and then Portugal was expelled under the decree of Ferdinand and Isabella, and this was considered, at least before the Holocaust, as sort of the defining moment in Jewish diasporic history, right? So if you went back to, if you take from 70 CE to the late 1930s, the expulsion from Spain was the most horrific event to happen to the Jews. And Scholem's point, again, right, crisis breeds creativity and a rise of mystical tradition, is you immediately have the mystical tradition of Isaac Luria in the town of Sfat in northern Israel that grew and rose in direct response to this tragedy of the expulsion from Spain. Right, Isaac Luria lived right in the generation really right after Spain, and Isaac Luria's whole project, in some sense, was to attempt to contextualize destruction in Jewish tradition and exile. The example that I think is interesting is if you read the Talmudic tradition, the Jewish legal tradition, and you ask the question of why do bad things keep happening to the Jews? The answer that the Talmud gives, and the answer that our Siddur gives, right, our prayer book, and the answer that many Jewish legal texts give is in some way it's our fault, right? This is very clear, right? Say on, Passover during Musaf, right? The additional prayer, you say, Mipnei chata'enu galenu meretzenu, right? Because of our sins, we have been exiled, right? And the Talmud in many places sort of agrees with this, right? We say this, over and over again in traditional Jewish prayer, right? It's our fault that these bad things are happening to us. And Isaac Luria, for a variety of reasons, right, did not, either agree with or he wanted to contextualize this in another way. And so what Isaac Luria said, and I'll sort of move on, go a little bit quicker because we only have, in theory, 15 more minutes, but we can do this, is that Isaac Luria gave a radical new theology of Judaism. And what Isaac Luria taught is that in the beginning of creation, in order for an infinite God to make space for something that's not God, God had to retract, right? What's called tzimtzum. This is probably one of the most commonplace ideas in Kabbalah. So I'm going to guess, some of you might have heard of it, some probably haven't. But for Isaac Luria, creation of the world starts off with a divine contraction. In other words, in order for a God who's infinite to, right, you can just think of it as an analogy, right? If you have a pool that is completely full with water, right, to the point where if you add anything to it, the water is going to overflow. If you want to add something to that pool, right, you have to take out water. So in some way, if God fills every space in the universe and God wants to create something that's not God, you have to actually remove some of God, right? And so for Scholem, this is the creation story, right? Or what he calls the, sometimes it's called the Lurianic myth, is divine contraction. When this happens, this created a brokenness in the world, right? There's a couple of different formulations in this, but for God to remove some of God's self for the world results in what's called in Kabbalah Shvirat HaKelim, this great bursting of the vessels of light. And this creates catastrophe because all of a sudden the world is devoid of God and there's brokenness in the world and there's darkness and there's exile. And so exile, right, or pain or suffering for Isaac Luria is not a historic event. Yes, it happened after the destruction of the temple and it happened after the expulsion from Spain. But Isaac Luria, right, in the Middle Ages, taught that catastrophe and exile is actually a primordial condition, right? That, yes, we can talk about negative events that happen in this world, but in some sense, our whole universe, right, went through a period of great catastrophe, right? Then when there's rupture, there also needs to be reconstruction, right? It's the name of the slide. And so for Luria, the last step is what he called tikkun olam, which is, right, this is probably more familiar to people here, which is the ultimate repair of the world, which is through human action, we can actually restore all of these sparks, right? And essentially bring God back into the universe and make the universe whole again. So you can kind of a little bit see where Scholem gets some of his ideas of, duality forces. For Isaac Luria, right, this sort of yin and yang between rupture and reconstruction are constantly happening. Now, for Luria, the Jewish people were central to this because it's the Jewish people who, through practicing Judaism, are the ones who are going to restore this divine harmony. And for him, the fact that Jews were spread out among the world was what allowed Jews to actually be spreading these ideas or doing these actions that actually help put God, right, and make God complete again, right? This is sort of Isaac Luria 101. We can spend, 4 months on just this one slide, so I won't do that. But enter Shabtai Tzvi, who was born about 100 years after Isaac Luria. And in the period after Isaac Luria, there was a rise of Jewish messianism like no other, right? One can read texts from the Jewish community in the late 1500s and early 1600s, right? This was also a major period of sort of global transformation for many other reasons. But Jews started talking about Mashiach or Messiah a lot more, right? There were all sorts of calculations of different Jews trying to perform all sorts of different, mathematical exercises to try to predict when would the Messiah come, right? There was a period of what we would call messianic imminence. And this happened, right, again, because of both the expulsion from Spain and the new ideas of Isaac Luria. In the Eastern European Jewish community in the late 15 or early 1600s, I think the early 1600s, you had the Chmielnicki massacres, right, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed by the Cossacks. And so another catastrophe, which means for Scholem, another attempt for the powers of mysticism to overcome the rabbinic, legal keeping it at bay. So you had this idea from Shabtai Tzvi, who was a Turkish Jew, right? He was from the Ottoman Empire. And he started teaching what some see as the logical conclusion of Isaac Luria. Again, Isaac Luria, the sparks need to be collected from around the world. Only when the sparks are collected, then the world will become whole again, right? The Messiah will come, God will be complete, all of that. And Shabtai Tzvi started teaching, and he said, we've been doing this for a while, right? Jews have been keeping Jewish law for thousands of years. And for whatever reason, the Messiah had not come yet. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place, right? I'll frame it like this. Maybe I can give it another framing in a second. But he starts to say, if the sparks are in exile, which is unholy, which is what Luria taught, then perhaps the sparks, right, the godly sparks, could be contained in other unholy places. And one of the unholy places that he starts to look is sin, right? In other words, he teaches that the Messiah is only going to come when all the sparks are redeemed. The sparks have been redeemed from all the pure places, right, from the places of mitzvah. So perhaps one actually needs to delve into the world of sin and transgression in order to raise the sparks up from the realm of evil, of sin, of exile. And so he starts teaching this idea, right? This is what I started out with, which is that the way, and this is Shabtai Tzvi's idea, not Sholem's idea, but the way that Judaism needs to proceed is a commandment by the way of sin, a mitzvah haba ba'avera. This is a very provocative idea because for those that are familiar with, say, the Talmudic tradition, the Talmud has a whole debate about what it calls mitzvah haba ba'avera. And the case in the Talmud is a much more legalistic case, right? The case in the Talmud is, what if it's Sukkot, right? It's the first day of Sukkot, and I'm at Shul, and I realize, oh shoot, I forgot to get a lulav before the holiday, and I just go to Shirley and just steal her lulav, right? And then I walk to synagogue, and I've stolen Shirley's lulav, and I, do the prayers with Shirley's lulav, right? The Talmud says, right, that is a mitzvah haba ba'avera, right, a commandment by way of sin, and that's not a mitzvah, right? The Talmud's very clear, right? I should not do that, right? You should not steal someone's lulav, and if you do, it does not count, because doing a mitzvah by way of transgression is not considered a mitzvah, right? The ends do not justify the means. Shabtai Tzvi, one, changed the meaning of this. He also made this theological, and he said, perhaps the way that Judaism needs to proceed is actually doing commandments by the way of sins, right? In other words, you could fulfill the ultimate purpose of Jewish law through actually breaking Jewish law, right? There's a quote by Jacob Frank, one of his later followers, who said, "I came not to elevate your spirits, but to humiliate you to the bottom of the abyss, where you can get no lower, and where no man can rise by his own forces, but only God can pull him with his mighty hand from the depth." In other words, a type of just religious, both Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank, a type of religious nihilism where we've tried all from the realm of good, so perhaps we need to dwell into the realm of bad, and either we'll come out of there, or God will redeem us from there, or just something that has to change, because, again, going back to Sholem's theory, Jews have been good, God-fearing, legal practicing people, and it seems like terrible things keep happening. We were kicked out of Spain, we're butchered in Eastern Europe, the Chmielnicki massacres. Clearly, we're doing something wrong. And there was Shabtai Tzvi quickly gained some well-known support. A man named Nathan, who was a well-known Kabbalistic rabbi in Gaza, proclaimed Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah. And Shabtai Tzvi, according to some estimates, by the height of his popularity, about 40 to 45% of Jews in the world believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. Doesn't mean that they were necessarily all doing this mitzvah haba ba'aveira. I'll give one example, right? Shabtai Tzvi. There are stories of Shabtai Tzvi that suggests that on Yom Kippur, he would get up in front of his congregation and make a blessing over food and eat it, right? He would make kiddush on Yom Kippur, explicitly saying that he's breaking Yom Kippur for a holy purpose, right? It seems completely crazy, and we'll see in a second how Scholem completely uses this narrative to talk about Judaism and the Jewish community. We might end up going 5 minutes over, but it's an essay called The Holiness of Sin, right? Or Redemption Through Sin, as it's called in other places, this is one of his most powerful essays, and you can read it online. It was published sometime in the 1950s or 60s. And he writes as follows. He says, prior to the French Revolution, right? So this is the emancipation that we were talking about earlier. The historical conditions were lacking, which might have caused this upheaval to break forth in the form of an open struggle for social change, with the result that it turned further inward upon itself to act upon the hidden recesses of the Jewish psyche. In other words, this goes with what we were saying before. In other words, in the pre-modern time, the historic conditions were lacking that still kept the forces of mysticism at bay, right? He then goes on, he says, but it would be mistaken to conclude from this that Sabbateanism did not permanently affect the outward course of Jewish history. The desire for total liberation, which played so tragic a role in the development of Sabbatean nihilism, was by no means a purely self-destructive force. On the contrary, beneath the surface of lawlessness, antinomianism, and catastrophic negation, powerful constructive impulses were at work. So we'll talk a little bit more about this thesis right now, but where Scholem becomes the most controversial and where we're sort of leading up to is this event of Shabtai Tzvi and his false messiah, which was viewed as an embarrassment par excellence by everybody, right? The rationalistic Jews in Western Europe who wanted to, rid Judaism of any mystical elements, of course, wanted nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi, right? This is the most embarrassing moment of Jews getting caught up in mysticism and messianism, right? Being misled by this guy, Shabtai Tzvi. The Orthodox Jews, right here I'm using Orthodox in the normative sense, right? The mainstream rabbis, right, viewed this as an embarrassment because, oh my goodness, how could much of the Jewish world have gotten caught up in this false messiah? And also many rabbis at the time also agreed Shabtai Tzvi might be the messiah. So what an embarrassment for Jewish leadership to proclaim this guy the false messiah. By the way, just to finish off the story of Shabtai Tzvi, once he leads 40% of Jews, right, proclaim him to be the messiah, he gains enough social power that he decides that he is going to confront the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire on behalf of the Jewish community to essentially say, we are going to march to Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem was under control of the Ottoman Empire then. We're going to go back to Jerusalem and I'm going to rebuild the temple and all of that. And the Sultan, right, for some reason didn't love the fact that Shabtai Tzvi said he's going to challenge his throne, and so put him in jail. And once he was in jail, many people were visiting the Sultan and basically said, this guy's dangerous. He's trying to foment a religious and political revolt against the Ottoman Empire. You need to do something with him. So the Sultan gives Shabtai Tzvi an ultimatum. I'm going to kill you if you do not convert to Islam, and Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam and spent the rest of his life living as a Muslim. Now, the problem, right, this is just a fun Jewish historic tidbit, and then we'll get back to this slide, because we're not talking about Shabtai Tzvi, we're talking about Gershom Scholem, but this is fascinating, and Scholem actually has a whole essay about this one point. The problem is that if Shabtai Tzvi's whole philosophy is that one has to delve into the world of sin to actually raise up the godly sparks, when he converts to Islam, this is actually interpreted by some percentage of his followers that he is still on board with the original plan. And so there was actually various Jewish communities. Again, the majority of the Jewish community, once he converted to Islam, sort of woke up from their fever dream and said, okay, I guess this guy was a charlatan. But some percentage, again, it's unclear who, actually followed Shabtai Tzvi into his plunge into the depths of darkness, right? One example is a community called the Dunma in Turkey. This community actually still exists of Jews who outwardly converted to Islam, but inwardly still viewed their identity as Jews, right? It's a fascinating case. And other communities sort of did similar things. There was also a community in Poland that did the same thing, right? They outwardly converted to Christianity, but internally, right, still identified as Jews as well, to sort of follow Shabtai Tzvi's model of delving into the world of sin. But Gershom Scholem, in his summary of this event, writes a long article called "The Holiness of Sin." If you're going to read one thing that Scholem writes, read this essay. It's about 30 or 40 pages, a fascinating essay. But one, he makes a couple of claims that really upsets everybody. His first claim is a historic claim. His first claim is that Sabbateanism, this episode of Shabtai Tzvi, was not an aberration, right? He's not necessarily saying that it's good, right? He's not condoning it. He's not saying Shabtai Tzvi is a great guy, but he's also not condemning it as an aberration of Judaism. For Scholem, this is actually a very natural part of Judaism. Again, his dialectic approach of Judaism, Sabbateanism, is one of the chapters that myth or mysticism was able to overcome the sort of legalistic forces that keep it at bay. And so for Scholem, unlike both the Western European rationalistic scholars and unlike the Orthodox community, who both viewed Sabbateanism as this crazy thing gone wrong, Scholem says, look, you're going to have a religious tradition such as Judaism with dynamic forces. Sabbateanism is going to be a natural part of this. And to sort of add some evidence to Scholem's claim, Shabtai Tzvi was not the only false messiah in history, right? There were plenty of others in the medieval ages before Shabtai Tzvi. There were some false messiahs after, right? And what Scholem is saying, right, is that it seems very captivating in some sense that every couple of generations you have this sort of overwhelmingness of mysticism that actually takes over for a while. His second claim is that Sabbateanism had a much larger effect on Judaism than people want to admit. One, in terms of sheer number of followers. Again, this number of, 1/3 or 40% of the Jewish world, this comes from Scholem. Before, if you were to go into the year, again, 1900 and ask people about Shabtai Tzvi, everybody would have heard of him if you were involved in the Jewish community. But people very much wanted to try to downplay the effects, right? This was a small fringe movement, a couple thousand. And Scholem, through, some painstaking historic work, he says, actually, no, you can read writings of Jewish leaders from all across both Europe and the Sephardic world. And it seems like everybody was pretty optimistic about Shabtai Tzvi, and people did explicitly believe that he was the Messiah. But more importantly, to Scholem's claim, and this gets into the overarching claim of Scholem, and if this isn't the last slide, it's the second to last slide, so it'll be done in a few minutes. For Scholem, Sabbateanism came up with a set of ideas that is the primogenitor or the force that influenced all modern Jewish movements. In other words, Shabtai Tzvi becomes the defining figure in Jewish history to begin what he calls Jewish modernity. So yes, Shabtai Tzvi had some negative impact, and I'll get into the Jewish modernity stuff in a second, right? The negative impact is there was a crisis, there was loss of trust in rabbinic leadership, all of that. But more importantly for Shabtai Tzvi, for Gershom Scholem, Shabtai Tzvi actually had a generative, and some people read it as Gershom Scholem saying a positive impact on the Jewish community as well. One, it allows creative religious forces to come to the forefront, right? That we discussed as well before. But if we talk about Jewish expressions beyond legalism, in other words, what does a commitment to a higher Jewish purpose look like, not through the realm of strict Jewish law? For Scholem, all of that original force came from Shabtai Tzvi. So what does that mean? That means if you think about any modern Jewish movement that is a group of people that value Judaism but don't do it through the lens of Jewish law. So think the Haskalah, you could think even somewhat the early Hasidic movement, certainly you could think Reform Judaism, you can think Zionism, right? Scholem sort of explicitly names all of these. For Scholem, these movements all contained traces or were rooted in Sabbateanism, right? As being the ultimate culmination of the mythical forces over the sort of Jewish legalese construct. And so just to summarize his big ideas, and then we can take some questions, and I know some people might have to leave. Judaism is shaped by constant tensions, right? There's a constant dialectic within Judaism. Crises throughout Jewish history release these suppressed forces, and even the most dangerous movements are able to generate positive historic things, such as Sabbateanism. And for Scholem, again, modernity, what it means to be a modern Jew, actually emerges from the rupture of Sabbateanism and this, false messiah and the mystical tradition, coming to, again, transform what we now know to be Jewish tradition. And so Scholem comes across as somewhat of a religious anarchist, right? He clearly, one of the things that people endlessly debate is, did Scholem sort of see himself, as a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, right? Probably not literally, but in some way, yes, metaphorically. In other words, for Scholem, the mystical tradition of Judaism, which again is just as much for him an authentic version of Judaism as what we think to be traditional Judaism, right? Jewish law, the Torah, the Talmud, all these things, right? That is just as much of a part of Judaism. And Shabtai Tzvi, even though obviously the story had a horrible ending and everything, and in some way was terrible, from some other way this really broke open, right, the sort of dam that was holding back all of this Jewish creative mystical power at bay. And once Shabtai Tzvi broke this dam, it was only a matter of time for you to actually have some positive movements that arise from this anarchism. And so Scholem frequently quoted the Isaac Luria idea that that for every single person they have their sort of own version of Torah, right? This is a famous idea from the Kabbalists, where Isaac Luria taught that right, there's this idea that the Torah has 600,000 letters or words. So every word of the Torah has 600,000 faces, that is, layers of meaning or entrances, one for each of the children of Israel who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. Each face is turned towards only one of them. He alone can see it and decipher it. Each person has his own unique access to revelation. In other words, for Scholem, there's no such thing as what all Jews should be doing and the Jewish meaning and what Jewish orthodoxy is, because by definition, given Jewish creativity, it's going to be different for every single person. Now, needless to say, and I'll go 45 more seconds, Scholem was criticized in many different ways by many different people for many of his ideas, right? That sort of goes beyond saying. But just in his last thing I'll say about Scholem is, for him, all of these modern Jewish movements, right? And again, Jewish modernity itself were only made possible by this creative force of Sabbateanism. And so a couple people, I think Mark and then Matthew, both asked at some point, how does this affect modern day Jewish community? And in some way, right, Scholem would suggest that Jewish modernity, right, the very definition of Jewish modernity is when this creative tension is sort of broken beyond repair. And so he would talk about Jewish modernity as a period of, right, the sort of classical forces that were in this dynamic relationship no longer exist in a creative tension, right? You have some Jews who are fully, you know, um, had distanced themselves from tradition. You have some Jews who only care about the legalistic tradition, but Jewish modernity is a breaking of this creative tension of Jewish history. Whether or not that's good or bad, again, that depends on exactly how you read Scholem. But his diagnosis of both Jewish history and the Jewish past, again, is extremely provocative. I think very interesting. Again, I'm more than happy to hang out for a couple of minutes if there are questions. I apologize for going 8 minutes over time. And I'll just say before I pass it to Ramarsha, this is a 5-week series on 5 different thinkers. So next week, I would love for you all to come back. We're going to be talking about Yeshayahu Lebowitz, very different thinker than Gershom Scholem on many different issues, but it's going to be, sort of similar, both biography and also big picture questions. Ramarsha, I don't know if you wanted to share anything before we get to some questions.
So I had the opportunity while I was taking care of what I had to do to listen to the class. Was fascinating, as it always is. I see a lot of Daniel fans here, some friends from Temple Beth Tikva, maybe some Hillel people, and so glad you're here. Know that the opportunity to bring Daniel to our online community is through your support. So if I did put in the chat, if you're able to make a donation to attend this class, makes a big difference for us. And we appreciate it very much in any amount. is wonderful. And I'm just so glad. And Daniel, like already. I just want to say, in this class, I thought of the next three classes I want to ask you to teach. I learned so much, and I want to ask you to address at some point whether the Rebbe's Chabad as we know it is exactly one of these disruptive things that happen in the wake of the Holocaust that literally has changed Judaism forever. I mean, it seems like it fits right into his umbrella of typology. Is that true?
Yes. This is when I get myself in trouble. Yeah, I'm totally kidding. Um, so Scholem had actually a very interesting theory of Hasidic Judaism that's no longer considered, academically, reputable. That's probably the wrong word, but is no longer accepted as the mainstream interpretation. Which for Scholem, Hasidism was actually a suppression of Messianism, which is quite interesting because today we think of Hasidic Judaism as the most messianic. So I think you're probably right that the 20th century, right, changed Hasidism. But Scholem's interpretation of Hasidism, he has a whole essay on this. It's a very interesting interpretation, even if it's no longer considered the sort of most reputable, is that what Hasidism did after Shabtai Tzvi is that many of the followers of Sabbateans were the early Hasidim, right? So he sort of traces this, right? This is already a little bit controversial because he suggests it was all the Jews in Eastern Europe that were the most pro-Shabtai Tzvi. And then here you have Hasidism happen 50 years later, looks very similar, right? You have a charismatic leader who was very interested in Kabbalah, that was performing miracles, right? Both Shabtai Tzvi, right? There was a question there about what did Shabtai Tzvi actually do that made people believe he was the Messiah, right? Both a lot of mystical interpretations of the Torah, right? So Nathan of Gaza was key for people believing Shabtai Tzvi, but also performing miracles. Again, what exactly did it look like for somebody like the Baal Shem Tov to perform miracles, right? Unclear, but even today, I mean, there are people that are able to very quickly gather large followings of people by doing something that seems paranormal, right? Again, depending on your personal beliefs, you can think that's all an act or, tapping into some reality. We don't have to touch that now. And so, but for Sholem, the Baal Shem Tov and early Hasidism attempted to neuter the messianic impulse by internalizing it. And so what he said is that Hasidism said that the Messiah is not some external thing, but the Messiah is something that happens inside each one of us. So it's not that we need to repair the world. It's that we need to actually focus on the self and repair ourselves. And then through that, one day the Messiah comes. But for him, Hasidism took the focus from external to internal. Now, I think you're probably right that the Holocaust, both in Chabad and also to Mark's point before, I don't know if Mark is still here, but I've been talking about this with Mark for many months now, is the religious Zionist community as well, I think, is also probably, right, the sort of resurgence of Messianism coming after, crises or big historic upheavals. So the Holocaust is the obvious one with Chabad, and both the 6 Day War, which again is not a crisis in the negative sense, it's sort of a rupture in the positive sense, right? Here you have some historic event that seemed unbelievable even 2 years prior, and all of a sudden now the 6 Day War happens and Jews are in control of biblical Israel, right? Yehuda and Shomron and East Jerusalem and the Western Wall and Temple Mount. And so for him, this also would probably represent some crisis. Now Scholem, to Mark's point before, I'm glad that Mark is still here. Scholem in an interview in the 1970s during the Gush Emunim movement, which was the settlement movement after 1967, commonly referred to religious Zionists as neo-Sabbateans. And he probably meant it in a negative way, right? In other words, again, Sholem's view of Sabbateanism is unclear. He sometimes speaks about it very positively and sometimes very negatively. Again, he was a very nuanced thinker, so I think he viewed it as having generative, creative force, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. Here, he almost certainly meant it for bad, right? He meant it that they were sort of breaking all the norms in order to hasten Messianism, right? As opposed to sort of, following, norms. And this is similar to his essay that he wrote in 1929 criticizing Jabotinsky, because again, he later on in his life, and we sort of didn't get into this, but he was a steadfast, ardent Zionist, and he also was very sort of uncomfortable with many of the moves that Israel made in the 60s and 70s, to the point where he actually moved back to Europe because he, no longer felt that his views were sort of normatively acceptable in Israel, and so he never stopped being a Zionist, but he certainly was not happy with the many directions that Israel was taking. Again, I think part of connecting to this. So I love the question about the Rebbe and this as well. Any other thoughts or questions, or before we?
And just tell
Yeah.
give it, who's next week?
Yeah, so next week we will be talking about Yeshayahu Lebowitz. Yeshayahu Lebowitz is probably one of the most important Israeli Jewish philosophers that people in America don't really know. For whatever reason, his legacy, he's almost like the reverse Mordechai Kaplan. For those who know who Kaplan was, he's probably one of the most important figures in American Jewish history and American Jewish thought, and no Israelis ever heard of him. And so Yeshayahu Lebowitz is sort of the mirror image, right? He's one of the most important modern Jewish theologians in Israel, and for whatever reason, mostly because his works weren't, all that translated and whatever, but he was a major Jewish theologian. He was somewhat Orthodox, and we'll see, some of his views on that. He was also a very fierce critic of religious Zionism, right? His famous quote, and this will be the last thing I'll say because I'll save this for next week. He used to say, I'm religious and I'm a Zionist, but I'm not a religious Zionist. That's sort of one of his big taglines. And so he had all sorts of fascinating views about Israel and Judaism and Jewish law and all of that. He was also a ferocious Bible scholar and Bible commentator. Many people in America have heard of Nechama Leibowitz. She wrote, or his sister wrote a commentary that is quite popular in America. We could talk about that a little bit, but we'll see a couple of his commentary on the Torah oftentimes refers to modern politics in all sorts of interesting ways. So we'll see him next week. And
Nechama is his daughter. Is that correct?
I thought it was his sister, but I could be wrong. If anyone knows.
We had a wonderful class on her offered by Professor Leah Hartman last fall after your class on modern thinkers. It was so fascinating, and I will try to gather that to share it with the group after your class with Yeshayahu. Maybe you're right. How old would Yeshayahu be now? Do you know?
Well, he died in the 90s, so
he died in the 90s. Okay, so you're right.
Yeah.
It would have to be brother and sister. There you go. All right. Thank you, everyone. Glad you were here.
Thank you all.
See you next week.